Right. Good afternoon. Good to see you once again and to have you yet again on our Civic Space Uganda Diaspora show. And today I come to you live from very beautiful gardens around Kampala. I needed some fresh air, so I came here to. It's a bit hot, not as hot as it is that side, but yeah, that here. Okay. So today we are looking at a very interesting conversation, and it's been ongoing, albeit not on national, spaces, but it's an ongoing conversation. And this is the role of African diaspora, but particularly looking at it in line with the Africa Liberation Week, which most people call the Africa Day. And this is going to start from the 22nd to the 28th of this month, and that is May, across the continent. They're aiming at commemorating Pan-Africanism, looking at Pan-African cooperation and solidarity. And the theme, the theme says a borderless Africa, but it has several sub-themes. And I think I find the sub-themes very interesting because they say fight against inequality and multiple crises facing Africa, including food, energy, and climate change. I think those are some of the very interesting conversations we ought to have as Africans, but also as Africa diaspora. Now, I want to welcome you, Milton, once again, and to ask you that we have had these celebrations over the years. And in fact, it is also commemorating the founding of the Organization of African Unity, or AU, which is now African Union, created on May 25th, 1963. So we are celebrating 60 years. So here is, if we look back from the journey that Africa was, the past, the present, and what Africa looks like going forward, the question to you, Milton, would be, where do you see Africa headed? And when we bring in the role of the diaspora, is the diaspora really, is its hand in the development of Africa or the future of Africa felt anywhere?
Okay, thank you, first of all, for hosting this conversation today. You know, Pan-Africanism, of course, is one of my most favorite subjects and topics, because to me, it is the key to the liberation of Africa, true liberation of Africa. So we've had 60 years of more or less so-called independence. And I say so-called independence because even though most African countries gained their official independence and the formal end of colonial rule in the 1960s, the colonialism really did not end in substance. And that has been the problem. You know, when you tell a patient that the patient is cured, the patient could feel good because you told the patient is cured. But when the malady is still actually there, then of course it means the patient is not cured. In the case of Africa, what was the problem with colonial rule? The problem with colonial rule was not that Europeans were governing Africa, even though some people are misled to think that was the case. You cannot convince me that the millions of Africans who mobilized in the countryside and they protested, you know, in some countries it was won by civil disobedience and protests, such as Ghana, for example. So it was relatively minimal bloodshed. In countries like Kenya, they had to wage armed struggle under the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, which the British demonized as Mau Mau. Many people use the term Mau Mau, not knowing that it was actually a negative word created by the British. In what was Rhodesia, they had to mobilize and go to the bush, and they fought for independence. And they won. Now it's Zimbabwe. In South Africa, it was a mix of armed resistance and eventually negotiation after Nelson Mandela was released. But many people make the mistake that they were fighting to get rid of European rule. That's incorrect. They were fighting to get rid of exploitation, because that was what colonialism really was. They forced Africans to work, whether it was in the mines, whether it was in the farms, and all the profits were being shipped to Europe. That was the problem. It was not the problem that the governors were Europeans. Of course, that was the superficial problem. How can you be an African country and be governed by Europeans? So that was part of the problem. But the essential part was being exploited. That's what Africans wanted to end, right? So in the 1960s and in some countries later in the 1970s, like the Portuguese colonies, in South Africa, of course, not until Mandela was elected president in 1994. But look at the condition objectively right now. How better off are African countries today when compared to at the time they ended colonialism? Most of them are still dependent either on Europe or the United States or on China. They are heavily indebted because they take loans from the World Bank and the IMF, and the conditions of those loans are very oppressive. They tell you, okay, don't subsidize education. Don't subsidize healthcare. Don't subsidize your farmers, when most Africans are farmers. When you find in the United States, they subsidize their farmers to the tune of $30 billion every year. In fact, they pay them, some of them, not to grow food. They subsidize farmers in Europe. So look at the condition objectively. We have not really yet won independence. And that is why when people talk about neo-colonialism in Africa, it is quite true. It is not just some theoretical word. It is the objective condition of many African countries today. So until African countries can take, until African countries can take total control of the economy, they will never be able to control their politics and the destiny of the people in African countries. And one way to do it is what Kwame Nkrumah preached, and that's the importance of Africa Day, when the OAU was founded, as you said, in Addis Ababa. He said, we must unite now, immediately, or perish. Otherwise, we will always be exploited because we will not be strong enough to protect our resources and use it to build Africa. That is still the only solution, in my view. A borderless Africa, a United States of Africa, a powerful Africa. Let me just give you one more point before I yield. And I've given this point before in our earlier conversation. In 1960, and anybody can go back and look at this data, the per capita income of China, the People's Republic of China, was 90 United States dollars, according to the World Bank, 90. That of Ghana was 189. Think about that. Double that of China. That's not a very long time ago. Of course, today, China is a global superpower, an industrial economy, powerful, almost rivaling the United States. And in 10, 15 years, will surpass the United States. China does not depend on the World Bank and the IMF. China sets its own policy over its economy and its politics. That's what Africa needs to do. If China could do it in such a short time, Africa with all its resources, in fact, China is now growing using Africa's resources. So if Africa can use its resources for Africa, Africa will become a power. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Milton, for that. I take away two things in your conversation, in your submission: total control of the economy is what Africa needs, and then it will be in charge of everything else African. And you also talk about the United States of Africa, something that is very dear to me, but I worry because our regional cooperation, our regional integrations from the different regions of the continent worry me, because look at East Africa. We are not entirely, together. We are not entirely working to align our agendas together. Look at West Africa, same story happening. South Africa, same story happening. And so when you talk about a united Africa, I worry that that is still some light years away. But we are glad to be joined by Dr. Sarah Bireete. It's good to have you this afternoon. And we are looking at the Africa Week. We are looking at African Liberation Week, and we are particularly looking at the role of the African diaspora in all this. And so we get to realize that while we celebrate Africa Liberation Week and focus on the role the diaspora is playing, we ask ourselves, first of all, does Africa recognize African diaspora? And why I ask this is one, I saw somewhere that the AU refers to Africa diaspora as the 6th region of Africa and expects them to play a role in achieving the AU Agenda 2063. Dr. Sarah, I want to come to you. You have been traversing this continent in different conversations, especially in Africa, economy, politics, and the like. When you look at the Africa diaspora being the 6th region of Africa, does it make sense at all?
Well, it makes sense. First of all, I think it's important to underscore the fact that the African liberation story started with the Africans in diaspora. The students' movement, especially at that time, as well as members of academia and other professions that were staying in diaspora then. And the student movement in diaspora, the African student movement in diaspora, decided to move back to Africa and mobilize for its independence together with the other pro-independence change makers then. So having recognized this contribution, I think it's also important to underscore the second fact that our economies now have a big portion of remittances from citizens in diaspora, from the African in diaspora. And some of the Africans in diaspora are playing a key political role in the governance spheres of our country by interacting with the key actors in the international community. So these are key 3 roles that you cannot take away from the Africans in diaspora. And going back to Nkrumah, I've just returned from Ghana. And regardless of the economic challenges Ghana is facing, you really see the strength of the indigenous economy in Ghana. Ghanaians own the economy. You go to all their shops, they sell goods made in Ghana. Look at what they wear. Yeah. They wear their own clothes. They produce what they consume. The sloganeering that President Museveni and others have remained with. They have remained with Pan-African sloganeering without action. But when you go to Ghana, you see action. I was staying in the part of upscale Ghana, but there is a common talk in Ghana that the ordinary people own the town. They own Accra. The Mwananchi own Accra. As you move from Ghana town, you go to the Supreme Court opposite where the Kwame Nkrumah Presidential Library is. Next is the Commercial Bank headquarters. Next is the Central Bank. And in the neighborhood are big markets like Owino. The Owino of Accra is surrounding the Central Bank. So when you look at these intentional actions of the real Pan-African leaders, then it distinguishes what the late Garang called masqueraders. You clearly see the line drawn in the sand between real Pan-African leaders and masqueraders who are the majority on the continent. When you come back home, what portion of the economy do we own? We cannot balance our trade sheets because we import more than we export, and we consume what we don't produce. So when Kwame Nkrumah said that seek ye first the political kingdom, and then the rest shall be added unto you, he had assumed that with political independence and political power, then the Africans would better govern their resources for the betterment of the African people. But unfortunately, we stopped at the sloganeering of political independence and never worked for the real social and economic independence. And that's why Africa is in a state where it is, regardless of having all the majority resources in the world and the most productive population in the world with the biggest size of freshwaters in the world. It's a big shame.
Well, it's a big shame indeed. And, you know, when we keep saying it's a big shame, at what point do we cover up? Because we are embarrassing ourselves. And this is the point, really, I want to begin with, Miriam. We continuously say it's a shame. Our leaders are ashamed. Our political situation is really bad. Our economic situation is equally worse. So at what point do we decide to cover up? At what point do we, you know, change the narrative? And Miriam, I ask you, because we have seen on this particular show that the role of the diaspora, not only for Uganda, but across the continent, is huge. And like Dr. Sarah has said, we cannot underscore the remittances, especially that come in. Miriam, can the African diaspora be, from what they started, can they go back and rally themselves to take on the mantle, to change the narrative on the African continent?
It's true, it's the African diaspora which rallied for independence. Of course, they didn't do it alone. The Africans on the continent were also fighting for independence, like the so-called Mau Milton said it's an insulting word. I've never heard about that until now. There was struggles everywhere. The Waganda in Uganda were resisting the forced labor coffee production, and that's why they were calling it Chiboko, because they were beating people to produce a certain amount of coffee for the colonial government. So the Africans were already resisting, and then the African diaspora, or the Africans who were outside the continent, and they were also, the African diaspora, like the Pan-African movement, which was started by the Bireete boys. And that mobilization, the joint effort, culminated into the independence in the starting with the 1950s to the up to 94 when South Africa was getting independence. But today, there is disjointed efforts. There is some cohesion somehow, somewhere, but it's kind of disconnected. When we talk of the African diaspora, who are we talking about? There are Africans like me and Milton who recently left the continent and still have ties on the continent. There are people who left maybe so many decades ago, but they still relate to the continent. But then there are the Africans that were enslaved, that left the continent 100 years, so many 100 years ago, but still have the connection, have the ties to the continent, and those are mainly what is referred to as the sixth region, the Africans in diaspora, which are estimated to be 170 million strong population. So all those people, if they can join hands and focus on developing Africa, yes, they can create a very big impact economically, be it socially, education-wise, and in every other way. But the challenge today is how do we rally those synergies? How do we connect the African continent to the African diaspora? How do we create the channels? How do we create the awareness, the bonds to make the African diaspora focus on Africa. They don't have to focus like for political liberation only, but even investing in Africa, can they focus their resources to developing Africa? How can we rally skills transfer? How can we rally some of them even to return to the continent, to those who want to settle there and make an impact? And that's the work that should be done by the leaders on the continent, the African Union, with its 54 leaders, I don't know how many there are now, and the African presidents, the African ministries and the local governments. I see somewhere like in South Africa, I think they are like local chiefs rallying the African diaspora to come back and resettle in Africa, which is a good effort, but can it be emulated across board? But before we do that, can we clean up our house? Milton and Sarah talked about economic liberation. Without the economic liberation, the political liberation is a waste of time, because we are still tied by those conditions, and it's like a string that the West still controls the African resources through giving us expensive loans and us trying so hard to pay back. So ideally, we are still subjected to forced labor to develop the Western economies indirectly, which is also called the neo-colonialism. So how do we change that? How do we break that chain of enslavement, of economic slavery? That's something that we should all focus on. But people are the leaders really in the right shape of mind to focus on that right now. And when you look back to a case like Uganda today, or East African community, East African region, I don't know really what we can do. I mean, your guess is as good as mine. I don't know. Where do we start from?
Indeed, it's a huge question, Miriam, for many of us. And when you talk about our leaders, reminds me of what Dr. Sarah just said, that most of them are just sloganeering instead of taking action. Most of them are real Pan-African leaders in say, but not in action. And so when you talk about our leaders taking up, their role as leaders, I don't see that happening anytime soon. And when you talk about our economic liberation, it worries me, because at the moment, let's first a little bit focus on the remittances that come from African diaspora. They're huge, and they play a huge role to our economic situation. Now, first of all, we have a huge diaspora that would love to invest back at home, but we know the challenges therein. And I think we'll come to that in general much later. What I want us to focus on is how can the African diaspora refocus its energies, because somebody was writing and they said that Africa diaspora have actually the capacity, they have they're in a powerful position to effect change in our countries, but also on the African continent. And this, I come to you, Milton, and ask, really, with all the challenges the Africa diaspora goes through, look at the politics, look at the economics, look at investment, look at the brain drain that is happening. Do you think that going back, if they could look back and appreciate the role they played in the liberation, in the independence of African states, do you think they can go back at this particular moment and regroup to effect any changes?
I'm not exactly sure what you mean when you say regroup. Are you saying?
Milton, what I'm trying to say is, because if you look back in the earlier years, we know the role the African diaspora played. Maybe if I could take us back a little bit. It was part of the abolitionist movement. against the slave trade, to the
No, no,
conceptualization of Pan-Africanism. You get
Understand.
it? Okay.
The fight was a little much more, excuse me, clear at that time. When you're fighting to end enslavement, of course, it's very clear what you're fighting to end: the physical bondage and servitude of African people by European peoples around the world. When you're fighting to end colonialism, the physical manifestation of European colonial rule, of course, Africans were outraged by that and wanted to end that. Now, the so-called enemy is not that clear, right? You can't point, as you could point and say, we don't want Europeans ruling in Uganda or in Kenya or in South Africa, you see? So you could mobilize people around that and keep it very simple. Now, our challenge, as we've been saying in this conversation, is the economic exploitation, which leaves you weak and vulnerable to the physical exploitation of Africans. And to me, there are some institutions which we can identify clearly. But now we have to convince the masses in Africa, the youth in Africa, that these institutions play a critical role in continuing the exploitation of the African continent and African countries. And to me, one primary institution that I've already mentioned is the World Bank. Because if somebody can come and tell you what you should prioritize in your budget before they give you money, how are you going to develop? Especially if to them, education is not a priority. So they say you cannot subsidize that. If to them, agriculture is not a priority, you cannot subsidize that. Then what is a priority? Clearly, it seems to me it is not the development of Africa. It seems to me that these institutions actually are more determined to keep African countries dependent. And what do I mean by this? Africans are still exporting raw materials. This is what Africans were doing during colonial rule. Cash crops, right? Those are the production, the products dictated by the European colonial rulers. So Mozambique, Uganda, Sudan, you produce cotton, Egypt, cotton. This country, you produce, they call it here in the United States, peanuts, in Africa, groundnuts. You produce tobacco, you produce tea, you produce coffee. We cannot develop like that while we continue importing manufactured products whose cost relative to our raw materials is exponentially much, much higher. We can't do that. So we need to find a way to finance economic development in Africa independent of the World Bank. Sources of finance that do not impose those conditions that do not allow Africa to develop. And this is where diaspora perhaps can play a role. We remit billions of dollars annually. Is it possible to design a Pan-African bank where, because all these countries remit money, where a percentage of the money we remit is automatically transferred to this Pan-African bank that is equally owned by the African continent to finance development? Okay, we have the African Development Bank, ADB, but that's different. In fact, most of the capital of the ADB comes from foreign donors. So meaning the ADB is not even an independent African development bank. You see? So these are the kind of solutions that I think Africa in diaspora should be engaged in. And I just want to make one other point before I submit. I am a bit much more optimistic in terms of the creation of a borderless Africa. I'm not pessimistic at all, because at one point, people did not believe colonial rule would end in Africa as late as the 1960s. I remember there was a so-called Belgian liberal academic who wrote a paper around 1959 or so and said, okay, maybe Congo will be independent very soon, in about 100 years. Of course, Congo at least won its formal independence in 1960. You see, people did not believe apartheid would come to an end. But look at how Africans were mobilized against apartheid. Look at how the youth in South Africa were mobilized. I think the youth in Africa can be similarly inspired by the leadership to take the destiny of Africa under their control. And I believe they will see the benefit of creating a borderless Africa, maybe more so than the current entrenched leadership that we have in many African countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Milton. And a few things caught my attention. The enemy is not clear. I wonder if Dr. Sarah will agree with you. Is the enemy currently on the African continent not clear? And so you also highlight the issue of the Africa diaspora and global finance, because we are literally depending on all these global entities, financial entities. That aside, I come back to you, Dr. Sarah. Two things. The enemy is not clear. Is it true? And two, we are looking at with almost 1 billion people and vast natural resources. Africa has tremendous opportunity in enhancing its social, political, and economic development. But we also learn that these opportunities come with enormous challenges. And when we look at all these challenges at hand, is it our leaders? Is it Africa in general? Have we come down, or have we grown complacent because we fought slavery, dealt with it? We fought for Pan-Africanism. We have what a semblance of it. So where is the actual problem here? Because if we have enormous challenges, I don't agree that it is just economics.
You know, Lynn and the colleagues, the problem of Africa is known. It's leadership. And I don't know how unlucky we have been that, one leader after another, one country after another, you can only count for 6 decades of self-rule. You can only count up to like 5% of normal leaders.
Yeah.
The majority are crooks. I don't even know how they access power. I don't even know that the systems of governance have only managed to put crooks at the top. Africa has a population, as per May 19th, 2023, UN estimates of 1.4 billion people.
Yeah.
More than 60% of this population are youth. Very productive. Now, majority of them are highly educated, but also highly jobless. We have enormous resources. Tell me which other problem can exist in a country apart from leadership can fail to make Africa productive, if not the #1 highly developed part of the world. Let's compare with the United Arab Emirates. Many people, like arguing that Africa is young, we should stop being impatient, and we take all this mediocrity that happens on the continent with less complaints. The United Arab Emirates is 51 years old. A desert. The only resource they have is oil, which is a depletable resource. But how have they used their single resource to become the #1 business destination in the world? Everybody, all the global leaders, all the global entrepreneurs, you can count if anybody has not gone to invest in Dubai. What is the magic? You can argue that they have a monarchy, they don't have political contestation. But how has that leadership used their power to develop their country? Is what I want to focus on. And then we can go to other countries like Singapore and the rest, where when we launched the Common Man's Charter after independence in Uganda, Singapore implemented the Common Man's Charter and created social peace. that ushered involvement in Singapore that we all talk about endlessly, that we are unable to copy the basics. If you come home, who owns Uganda's economy? There used to be interesting series under Moi in Kenya of who owns Kenya. And they would produce series and series of Kenyan big businessmen. Most of them are local politicians. Who owns Uganda today? If you run this series in Uganda, you would be shocked. The Ugandans have been pushed to the periphery of the economy, of the politics, of life. And it's no wonder that we have the low-ranking officers on shooting rampage on the streets because of social strife. It was bound to happen. Social strife and state violence. The end result is that any argument now on the street, you can be shot because the state sorts out its arguments through tear gas and bullets, and they've set a standard.
Right.
So this is the dilemma that we are in Uganda, but you can also copy in Africa. I was 3 weeks ago in South Africa. I had a very disturbing conversation with one of the middle-class Uber drivers. I was asking him about the politics, and he said that in the next elections, he will vote for the, is it National Democratic Alliance? The former apartheid party, which is now gaining a majority, majority support of blacks. Even in the last elections, NDM took more seats using its black membership, black African membership. It is no longer a white minority party. So I asked him why, and he said because they've been disappointed by the ANC leadership.
Right.
And apart from the racial segregation, they think that the whites have more morals and are more disciplined and can enforce equitable development as compared to the ANC leaders, especially Zuma and Cyril Ramaphosa. So if you look at that trend of disappointment, I mean, the standard that Mandela had set in South Africa,
right,
the hope and jubilation we all enjoyed as African people at the end of apartheid, the statement, this is the last conversation I would have expected to have from the middle class educated South African Black people.
Right.
But it's common and it's happening. And the people are losing hope because of the mistakes of the African, National Congress. And they are looking backwards and saying, okay, even what we have today in terms of infrastructure was put by these people, except they had segregated against us. So if they can remove the segregation, they think they have enough discipline to handle national resources and develop their country. So the missing link in Africa is decent leadership, is discipline, is a democracy that is entrenched on values, systems, institutions, and rule of law. We have still a big man syndrome, even where we thought we were building constitutionalism. The big man syndrome is eroding all the democratic gains that the world had counted in the African continent from 1995 and middle 2000s. It's very unfortunate.
Very unfortunate indeed, Dr. Sarah, and I couldn't agree with you more, because on the issue of decent leaders, agreed, and it cuts across the entire continent. Very sad for us. Miriam, I come to you, and we are looking at a very interesting development, and Dr. Sarah hinted on it a little bit. Africa is thought to be the second largest continent and holds some of the world's most valuable resources, yet it is responsible for only 2% of global trade, and sub-Saharan Africa remains the most poverty-stricken developing region in the world. Over half of this population lives below the international poverty line. Now, if I come back to Africa, we know that most African countries have put in place, governments, for example, have put in place good economic policies to attract investment within their countries. They have also put in place policies and initiatives to attract the diaspora. But Miriam, you and I know, we've had this conversation here before, that most African diaspora are scared of coming back home, are scared of investing back home for very many reasons. Lack of understanding of how risk is perceived, and of course how it is which is connected to barriers of investing in the continent. They also lack knowledge on which areas to invest in, but also persecution, political and economic persecution. So how can the diaspora move from that to what they used to be? I want to borrow the word, the backbone of African development.
I'll go back to what Milton said earlier, that the visible enemy that Africa can rally upon is the economic liberation, like the World Bank, and creating another vehicle which can be used to mobilize resources from the African diaspora to develop the continent. But I think another visible Milton could be the politics.
Yes, of course.
Without governance, how do we create that trust? How do we even mobilize? Where are you going to stand to mobilize? Today, you and me could be interested in mobilizing for Ugandan development, for instance. But where do you put the money? Where do you invest? Who are you going to trust your money to? The government is corrupt. Everything is controlled by the politics at the center. And the moment the politics go wrong, nothing can work. So can we maybe mobilize to reform the governance of Africa first, and then the money follows, or we can do both at the same time?
No, definitely.
I think referring to what Sarah talked about, can we? I think we can turn the challenge into an opportunity. Today, ideally, generally, Africa is having the leadership challenge. There are a few countries which are really on a good, positive step as far as governance is concerned, but the majority are really lagging behind, including our neighborhood in DRC, Sudan, and other African countries that are really struggling. And how do we turn that challenge into an opportunity? Can we rally? I think what Lynn is talking about is how do we rally the African diaspora effort to reform the continent? For instance, is it possible to rally the African diaspora to reform the politics inside Africa? There was some effort. For instance, when there was the ousting of Bashir, the movement inside the Sudan was joined by the other African diaspora, and they added on the voice and the energy, especially in rallying the international powers to protect the citizens, and that helped in changing the government so fast. But as we can see, the whole situation is now degenerating back into chaos. So the rallying of the political support should go beyond changing the leadership to how do we democratic institutions, how do we sensitize, create awareness among the ordinary people about governance, and how do we do that even when the politics is wrong? Today, I bet if you try to rally any African diaspora in Uganda or try to talk to ordinary people, you would be shot on the street. And it's chicken egg. Where do you start from? What do we start with? But I think with increased voices, especially joint voices, and African diaspora doesn't mean, for me, I don't want to look at African diaspora and just limit ourselves to the people outside the continent. For instance, the people on the continent, if you are South African, can you join hands with the Sudanese and reform the situation in Sudan? If you are Ugandan, can you join hands with Somalia and fight and look at solutions to stop the feminines in Somalia? So how do we harness the synergies? How do we joined the African population to organize beyond the political controls, beyond the political chain that is around us. Because I know power belongs to the people, whatever the effort the dictators put up and however much they try to shut the people down, once the people are mobilized, they have enough energy, they have enough capacity to really change and reform the politics in their country and even in outside countries. So the situation which really we can, the ideal situation is, how do we create that effort like what the Nkurumas created in the struggle for independence? How do we join hands inside the continent and outside the continent as Africans and people of African descent?
Absolutely, Miriam. And it's still a question, and you noticed that since the start of this conversation, we still end at the same point of what can be done. I hope at some point, as we continue this conversation, maybe at some point we shall find an answer to that particular question. Now, I come to you, Milton.
Yes.
It is thought that African communities have made progress, and we cannot underscore this. With an increased number of holding positions in power, positions in government, they still have a long way to go. Lack of resources for diaspora, first of all, to properly mobilize and organize to impact, one, national policies for that matter, foreign policies as well. And someone was hinting on the need for a Black think tank, or is it an Africa think tank, where everybody can come together and maybe reflect on critical issues relating to Africa and have some sort of progress. Do you think it is a good starting point?
Yes, of course. The kind of conversation we are having right now would belong in a think tank, a Pan-African think tank. And in fact, because of the new technology now, it's very relatively easy to form that, Pan-African think tank. We can get in touch with other digital spaces that are having similar conversation and expand from there. So that's actually a very good suggestion that can be followed up. And I hope in one of our future conversations, we will have other African platforms or Pan-African platforms joining us in this conversation, because we are having a conversation over issues that impact all of us. And if we are very eager for solution, it means there are many millions and millions of other Africans who are also exploring for this solution. And governance is absolutely critical, as Dr. Bireete said. I agree wholeheartedly. Look at what Thomas Sankara was able to accomplish in Burkina Faso in the 4 short years in which he was in power. Even though he came from the military. He came from the military, but he was a Pan-African. He loved Africa. He was very well educated, a lot of it self-educated as well. He had a professor who recognized him as a very intelligent young officer when he was just a cadet. And that professor used to go and give lectures to these cadets. But he identified a few of them who were highly motivated, intelligent, and he would invite them for extra tutoring at his private home. And Thomas Sankara was one of those individuals. And Thomas Sankara said, in Africa, we abuse or you misapply the potential of the military. He said, a soldier who does not have the proper consciousness and intellectual training with a weapon is just the same as a bandit. And that is the problem that we have in many African countries, of course. But Miriam spoke about, can we have other Africans involved in affairs of other African countries and put true Pan-Africanism in practice? If Thomas Sankara was alive today, I would be very happy to be working in Burkina Faso you know, I would be very happy to be there because I would support the program he was trying to do, give true power to the people at the grassroots, empower women, empower people at the grassroots level so they could take control of their lives and their affairs. So that's one example of the kind of leadership that Africa needs. But when we have that type of leadership, we have to try to protect them in a Pan-African vision as well, because those who still want Africa to remain in a neo-colonial dependency normally work very hard to eliminate those kind of leaders, which is exactly what happened in Burkina Faso. And that's, of course, why people like Patrice Lumumba was killed, people like Kwame Nkrumah overthrown. I want to make just one other point before I submit. In terms of the investments and the remittance that Africans send, that is very powerful. 100%, we can't deny that. But much of it is going into, I would call it almost like a band-aid. We are addressing the symptoms of our economic weakness, which of course is the poverty. When we send money, normally because somebody needs money to buy medicine, to go to hospital, to pay somebody's school fees, somebody had shortage and needs to pay some bills. So that's addressing symptoms. That cannot help us develop. So that's why my suggestion was that, of course, we want to address those symptoms. We can't have our relatives not go to school. So when they need some money for school fees, we will send it. But since we're always sending money, can we find a mechanism to just take a small percentage of that from the millions of Africans who are sending money? And that will amount to billions of dollars. And that can help us create a financial institution that would be independent of the World Bank. Actually, one more point I would like to make. Dr. Bireete gave the example of the Uber driver in South Africa, now willing to even vote for the party formerly dominated by the white people that ran the apartheid regime. That goes back to the point I made in the beginning. Remember I said Africans, even though, of course, they didn't want to be ruled by Europeans, they were not so much fighting against that. They were fighting to end exploitation and to improve their lives. And now that is why you have the South Africans saying something like that. Because at the end of the day, can I feed my family? Can I send my children to a decent school? Can I pay all the bills? You see? That is much more important than anything. And it seems that is now what is happening in South Africa and why the ANC is steadily losing its popularity. Thank you.
Thank you, Milton. Very interesting issues you highlight there. And something comes to my mind, and progress on the African continent requires targeted and human capital. Can you hear me? Sorry, it seems I was disconnected for a bit.
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. So I was saying that progress on the African continent requires targeted and strategic investment in human capital. And you did hint on something on when I talked about the think tank and digital spaces. And this comes to mind, the role of social media, because we know that African diaspora, they have different channels lately to help transform their countries. And this is through social media, which easily allows people within the diaspora to not only have access to people within the continent, but also have access to information pertaining to what is happening within their countries. Now, I want us to a little bit, because this is where we are, digital spaces, this is what we are leveraging on to make any social, economic, and political changes across the world, but particularly in Africa. Dr. Sarah, how do we leverage on social media to extend transformation, to extend economic liberation, to extend political liberation for the different spheres of our continent?
Yeah, thank you, Lynn. You see, the digital revolution, where social media comes in, ushered in new ways of citizens amplifying their voices in governance, but also for innovation and creativity. So if we use social media for example, the elements under e-commerce and e-knowledge, if we had a conducive environment for the young people to innovate and engage in a, be part of the digital revolution, but that requires access to internet. I know that the UN declared access to internet as a human right, but how many young people have access to internet? In Uganda, access to internet is the cost of internet is the most expensive in East Africa. But also East Africa still has high costs of accessing internet. I saw when the Biden administration in the US after the COVID wanted the infrastructure to build, among others, the 5G internet to make it accessible for everyone. But in Uganda, we have put a digital service tax on top of having closure of Facebook for 3 years because the people who were campaigning from Museveni violated the Facebook regulations and the accounts were closed. So you close a platform that is employing about 30% of young people, you close e-commerce, especially given the fact that Ugandans 3 times, the users of Facebook in Uganda are 3 times bigger than the users of Twitter and all other social media platforms combined. So when you have such challenges of bad governance, internet is supposed also to improve our elections through digital means. But the way we have had a manipulation of digitalized elections, you can use quick examples of Uganda, Kenya, and Nigeria. The controversy, when technology is supposed to do away with controversy and improve efficiency. So you have the mafias on top of their hacking games, also distorting the use of technology in our elections. And it's important to underscore the fact that the world is now on the fifth industrial revolution. But Africa is still grappling with the fourth industrial revolution of digital technology. We still have, we don't have open governance. We don't have e-government in most countries, except Rwanda, I think, has e-government. We have, because of corruption and the beneficiaries of corruption, they cannot allow the digital technology in governance to minimize cost, but also eliminate corruption. If you look at the expenditures of our parliament, if we had an e-parliament, we would save half of that money or more. But because the people in charge of decision making are beneficiaries of these analog, ambiguous, means of governance, they cannot enable the digital revolution to take place. So we have this still. It goes back to the leadership question. We still have leadership hindering digital revolution in Africa, hindering innovation, hindering technological advancement that is supposed to benefit commerce, science, education, and all spheres of life. I submit.
Thank you indeed. You remind me of something I was reading recently, that whereas the rest of the world has embraced the fourth industrial revolution, Africa and some of the countries are still in the first phase of the industrial revolution. And it's disturbing, because if we are holding back on digital transformation, on embracing what the world is today, then clearly we're going to remain in the back seat, and everybody's going to be stepping on our heads and doing better than us, and still we'll be trying. And the economic liberation that all of you have been hinting on will be useless. It won't be anywhere. So it brings me back to you, Miriam, and still in relation to social media, the role of social media, the role of digital spaces, and because this is where the world over is. everything has gone E. And you are in the US, and most probably everything is E, and it is simpler, and it is easier, and it is moving us forward. Here in Africa, we have a challenge of mindset, we have a challenge of education, we have a challenge of people have colonized us, and so we are in their small brains. They don't want to expand their brains to think outside the box. And so when we talk Africa liberation, economic liberation, when we talk about even our own country, Uganda, clearly social media, digital spaces are playing a major role. We are being hindered. Dr. Sarah has already said it. But if we are to leverage on what we have so far, what can we possibly achieve?
Lynn, if our problem is the politics and the politics are hindering us, let's mobilize and fight for political liberation as number one, because without the political liberation, nothing can be achieved.
But how has that gone? Every effort has gone down the drain.
Yeah, but it's possible. Actually, it's we can look at we can get inspiration from our ancestors when if they were able to fight slave trade, where they were able to break the chains. You know how tough that was. How can we not be able to change our governments? How can we not be able to democratize our governments? And I want to call upon the African diaspora, whoever is able to listen to this show, that if the Africans back home cannot be respected, cannot live a dignified life, the Africans everywhere, even in diaspora, like here in America, they will still be undermined by the rest of the population, the rest of the human races. If we are to get liberation as Africans, as people of African descent, we have to liberate the Africans from the continent. We have to fight for liberation for the African everywhere. And it's good we can sit and identify our problems. We know right now the African population, the young people are ready to embrace development. They are ready to embrace new political ideas that are liberating, and they know their freedoms, they know their rights. They have education, they have exposure, and they know how the rest of the world is living. So we already know what is wrong. Why can't we aim our effort at correcting that? It's hard, but it's possible. And our people have never done it. They have ever fought for liberation from colonialists and succeeded. It's very easy for us also to fight for political freedom and achieve it. We've said that in Uganda today, I mean, the development, economic development, whether for industrial growth or the technological, whether it's the IT, nothing is going on so far because of bad leadership. It's good we can identify the problem. If today you go to the hospital and they say you are not able to walk properly because you are dizzy and you are throwing up because you have malaria, then that's good. Just target the malaria and sort it out, and then you restore yourself to complete health. So in Africa today, we understand the problem, and the problem is the politics. Oh, okay, that's the first problem, and the neo-colonialism, the control of our economy from the imperial countries is the number two problem. Or both of them are topmost problems. So let's organize and solve those, or aim at improving that situation first, and then the rest will follow. I also want to point out that there is something that I think there is still more we can do, even when the politics is still not yet sorted out. Skills transfer. Today, how many Africans in diaspora who are, say, specialized doctors, great educators like Milton, researchers, scientists or business people, how much are they able to invest back home as far as their skills and knowledge is concerned? Have we put in an effort to mobilize those resources to make the people focus on contributing something back home to liberate the people in the continent? So there are so many avenues, and once you interest people in, say, in investing in economic development, those people will look at the bottlenecks, which is the politics, and they will be interested in solving the politics. Today, there is no way, for instance, I'm going to talk to an African American and say, hey, you know, Uganda is under dictatorship, ADCD will say, so what? But if today I tell him, you know, you can invest in Ugandan agriculture and you can do ABCD, but we also have a political problem. So before we invest, we need to sort this out. You can say, okay, yeah, that's a problem. Maybe I can contribute ABCD towards that, and we sort that out and we talk about development next. So there, I think there is still a way that we can achieve development. There is still a way we can liberate Africa. The independence struggle never ended as far as we are still under economic bondage. And so far, we see that we're still under the political bondage by our own dictators. So it's like the white men now in black faces.
Absolutely.
Our leaders are worse than the colonialists, like the example of South Africa they gave us. So it's not a lost cause. The problem is that, are we doing something toward seeking the solutions? Are we focused on looking for solutions, or we want to helplessly look on and maybe wait for God to give us like a magical solution somewhere?
We're waiting for manna to fall from heaven. And, you know, and you say something very interesting. Our leaders are worse than the colonialists that we fought previously. And they said, do not tie your goat to, I forget the other statement, but it means that you cannot have, you cannot
tell that your goat to a bad one.
And so you see what I mean. So maybe they learned from the colonialists, and so they are trying to remind us of where it came from. Now, Milton, somebody was saying that perception of who and what Africa is changing. I don't know if you've seen that somewhere, but it caught my attention. So what has changed? Is it the leaders? Is it the leaders? Is it the led, or then what? That aside, is Africa Diaspora therefore playing the leading role in defining the future of the continent?
The question is not clear to me. I'm sorry.
I was wondering if you could have a comment on the perception of who and what Africa is changing. I don't know if you have a comment on that.
Is that true, though? I mean, I think to me,
because we're looking at our leaders who have somewhat become our former colonialists, and what they're doing. Then I wonder if it is still the same. Two, I was asking as we begin, of course, to get into the winding up session: is Africa therefore? This is an independent question. Is Africa Diaspora playing a leading role in defining the future of the continent?
Okay, so let me handle the second question first. Definitely, I think we are playing a very significant role. You always play a significant role when you are remitting so much money, which in many cases for most African countries now exceeds the total money that African countries are getting from so-called foreign aid, which of course I say so-called because it's very inaccurate. The amount of monies that are transferred from African countries to the industrialized countries exceed whatever they so-called give to Africa by hundreds of billions of dollars, you see. But that's not factored in as aid from Africa. when they buy our resources for dirt cheap, that is a way of transfer of wealth from Africa to the industrialized countries. Mineral resources, agricultural resources, cheap labor when they come and they set up companies and they underpay African workers. That's a transfer of value. So foreign aid is actually the opposite way. It's coming from Africa to these industrialized countries. But that's a conversation entirely for another day. But for many reasons, including this type of conversation that we are having right now, Africans in diaspora can play a much more significant role because I think we are still underutilizing our potential. So I don't want to create a rosy picture. The best way to answer to that is that the capacity of the Africans in diaspora is being underutilized. So there's hope to escalate it even further and make it much more effective, including one suggestion that I repeat one more time, the creation of a financial institution that benefits every African country. That's something that's realizable, and I think we can achieve it. Now, in terms of the perception of Africa, the perception of Africa is let me answer it this way. Africa is still, and of course I'm overgeneralizing, but that's the only way to answer that question. Particularly in the United States and many Western countries, the perception of people that are incapable of managing their affairs, people that are prone to inexplicable acts of violence, people that are corrupt, people that are underachievers and can never gain the status of development that Europeans have achieved, that Asian countries have achieved. And part of it is because of the narrative of enslavement, of colonialism, and now even neocolonialism. In order to justify enslaving Africans, the Europeans developed a whole trove of literature to try to convince other Europeans and Africans themselves that Africans were inferior to Europeans. So that was to justify slavery. And then to justify colonialism, the same argument that they are not civilized, even though civilization started in Africa. We had kingdoms, of course, ancient Egypt was an African civilization. And Professor Anta Diop already proved that scientifically. He tested the melanin from the mummies from ancient Egypt, and he found the melanin content is consistent with Black Africans. So civilization started in Africa, but the Europeans portrayed us as quote unquote uncivilized to justify colonial rule, right? So that narrative, the remnants of that narrative is still with us today. It is so deeply ingrained in the European mind that many Europeans even do not believe today that Egypt is actually in Africa, you see? And of course, part of it is because the population of Egypt today is not the population of Egypt 5,200 years ago when Africans founded that civilization. The first king who unified Upper and Lower Egypt, you can even Google his image and the bust will appear. His name was Nama, and his features are as African as it gets. So that's why the image of Africa, and the image of Africa is maintained like that even today to justify, the continued exploitation of Africa. So, they say, oh, look at them, they can't run a country. Oh, look what they're doing in Sudan right now. Even though nobody says, oh, look at them, look what they're doing in Ukraine. These European savages killing each other left and right, Russians and Ukraine. But European conflicts are not seen in that context. With Europeans, they analyze it, they say, oh, these are border issues. These are issues that date back to the era of the Tsars in Russia. They find rationalizations and arguments But with Africa, it's projected as it's something innately African. Violence, corruption, and all that nonsense. When in fact, we know some of the biggest corruption happens in countries that have much more wealth, which is the West, you know? So thank you for that.
Thank you, Milton. Sarah, Dr. Sarah, I come to you and ask this same question because I need your mind on this. Is Africa diaspora playing a leading role in defining the future of the continent?
Well, if I could start with the Ugandans in diaspora, I was glad that in the last elections, Ugandans in diaspora took leadership and they played a key governance role in our politics. As compared to before, it was more, more prominent. And they have continued to advocate for better governance and human rights. If you look at Kenyans in diaspora with, proper voting rights, they are a big bloc. They play a bigger role. The same applies to if you go to West African countries, the West African, Africans in diaspora play a more prominent role. But they can do much more. They can do much more because I think the issue of the world being a global village is more practical now than ever before. All decisions are made in the bigger capitals where the Africans in diaspora are resident, economic, political, human rights. This has happened because we have failed as a continent. We have failed to really make a substantial contribution to the global dynamics as a continent. AU remains a periphery laughing stock, institution, occupying headquarters built by Chinese, and the joke is that it is all hacked by Chinese and controlled.
Right.
Where we could not even build our own home. So Africa has largely really remained on the periphery of decision making. Yeah. And this is, it's in our making. So to change it, the Africans in diaspora will have play a much more prominent role than the African diaspora that caused independence to happen. So it is time for the second independence, and the power lies with the Africans in the diaspora. Thank you.
Yes, the power lies in the Africa diaspora is a question I put to you, Miriam. Still, really, do you think the Africa diaspora is playing the leading role in defining the future of the continent?
Yes, they can play a big role, but I don't think they can do it alone. It's not easy to fight from outside. It needs a joint hands from the people in the continent, and then the diaspora can complement that. They can do a lot, for instance, in managing the remittances. But as Milton said, the money goes to consumers. Today, if I send a little cash to my mother, if I send something to my friend, that money is counted like remittances to Africa, but it was going to a private pocket. And it wasn't like a united fund which you can control and say put conditions and all that. So it's not easy to mobilize that effort into changing the situation back home. They can do a lot, like as Alia said, like saying skills transfer, and we talked about social media. Their voices, it's known that most African diaspora are in powerful positions where they can lobby for an impactful change. Some are in big international organizations which have power, the political power and other power. Some are in academia. Some are in other professionals which can lobby others to make some good demands which are aimed towards changing, making a positive impact on the continent. But are we mobilizing? How are we mobilizing the African diaspora to come up with something to aim their energy towards developing the continent. Today, the African diaspora is as disintegrated, and as they are scattered physically, but they are also mentally not coordinated towards developing the continent. Like in the past, like Milton earlier said, that was a visible enemy. We are under invasion. Today, if someone attacks your home and enter your home, you would really mobilize pangas and whatever and break the door and really push that person out. But today we are fighting an invisible enemy. And how are we mobilizing towards that? How many people are aware of what the struggle is really? What people are aware of what our challenge is as Africans, both in Africa continent and in African diaspora? I would like to point out something like, especially there is a big redundant force which we can wake up, and it can make a great impact towards the liberation of Africa. The academia, education institutions back home and education institutions in diaspora. Almost every American university and even European university I know have an African department where they meet and talk about Africa and how African diaspora can mobilize towards the development of African continent. But you rarely find any discussion in Ugandan institutions talking about African liberation. You rarely hear of a discussion in any Ugandan high school talk about Pan-Africanism, talk about how to unite Africa. You rarely hear students talking about Africa as African themselves, raising consciousness to Africans about their culture, about their identity, about their place in the world, about the role they play and how they can develop themselves. So if we can create that space in our education is one of those varied institutions that can be accessed by almost everybody. We earlier said that Africa has the largest, youngest population, and 50% of them, if not more than 50, are still school-going children, are still school-going adults. So those people, if we can plant a seed there, from there, and if we can harness ideas from there, they are both the physical, they have the physical energy we need to liberate Africa and the mental energies to create ideas, new ideas towards African liberation. But all of that energy is untapped currently, and it needs reawakening. And if you awaken such a number of population, the rest will follow. Even changing politics back home would be much easier, as it will create political consciousness on the grassroots.
I agree with you, Miriam, on the issue of political consciousness, which is the point you end with. And Dr. Sarah, allow me ask you this, because when we talk about political consciousness, we know that is going back to changing our curricula. It goes back to patriotism. It goes back to a lot of things, and we know what African leaders have been doing in stifling political awareness, political correctness, political trying to be for the people they're leading to be politically aware. We know what they have been doing. So if we are to say maybe we need to work on that, don't you think we'll have a major problem?
I don't think we have a major problem. You see, democracy in its simplest solution, it's a government of the people, for the people, and by the people. To make this a reality, you need an informed citizenry that can make informed decisions as who should govern them, and also with enough ability to hold their leaders accountable at all levels. including recalling some of the leaders that they consider useless, or even causing impeachment of some of the presidents that become irrelevant to their wishes, aspirations, and values as a people. So we need to continue sensitizing people, cause mindset change, create a critical mass of the citizenry that can cause change, reverse the democratic decline on the continent, and spark off the second revolution for Africa. There is no way out of that.
Yep.
Absolutely. Milton, do you agree with that?
100%, of course, I agree. She summed it excellently. And I think we can use social media to help that process. I am contacted so many times by young people in Uganda who want me to conduct online classes for them because they watch some of my lectures on YouTube, and they have asked me to design something. And in fact, I've actually agreed. Now, my only question, I'm wondering, are they going to have access to reliable internet to have that conversation? But I'm actually in the process of designing a series of lectures for young people in Uganda right now. I want to do it in 8 parts, perhaps, and focusing on African history so that they can understand Pan-African consciousness and how they need to link their struggle with other young people in other parts of the continent. And that is a way of skills transfer as well. And Africans in other professions should also use the digital space to transfer these type of skills to Africans on the continent, particularly the youth in Africa. I was having a conversation with some Nigerian friends, and I could not believe it. So I had to contact other Nigerians whom I knew to confirm that at one time in Nigeria, they were actually debating whether they should continue teaching history because they're saying it's not productive. They need to focus on the sciences to make them productive. That's where they can generate wealth and returns. But that's completely wrong. If you don't know your history, you'll be walking around like a zombie. You can't know or have even a vision of where you want to go if you don't know your past. And you certainly won't even know why you're in the predicament that you face today if you don't know your history. Thank you.
Yes.
And finally, the curriculum. You mentioned the curriculum.
Yeah.
That is very, very essential. What are the curriculum designed to produce? In terms of, if you look at China, I don't have any detail about their curriculum, but I'm willing to believe that it combines a good amount of history, a good amount of not only science, but applied science and economics. And I'm just judging by how the country has transformed itself. So if we want to transform our countries into a certain position, of course, it has to start with the curriculum because the people that are going to build it are the people that are going to be the students and then the graduates. So curriculum is very essential.
Absolutely. And as we had this conversation and as we continue to have this conversation, a few things come to mind and they're more pronounced. We are looking at, we are enjoying the remittances from the diaspora, the African diaspora. That is very important. And then we are not coordinated as an African continent, but also as the African diaspora. There is no coordination. We need to revise the academia and involve them in the transformation of Africa. Then the issue of brain drain, which we have not entirely talked about, and Milton and Dr. Sarah and Miriam, I bring this to your attention. The issue of brain drain. Whereas we want to rally Africa and have some sort of change and feel that we are owning the continent and making the right decisions for it, the issue of brain drain is still such a huge challenge. How then do we address it? I'll start with you, Miriam, and then I'll come back to the rest.
Brain drain is caused by the bad governance back home. Today, if you don't reward the skills you have, an example is in Uganda, we are losing most doctors, not because we have so many in Uganda, but because they are not rewarded enough and they go seeking green pastures. Some of the brain drain is caused by the bad politics, like the oppression. When people don't feel they are free, they run away to survive. And then unemployment, we usually, Lynn, talk about how we are losing our Ugandan young graduates to go and work as maids in the Middle East. You can imagine all of that expense, all those resources in human capacity that we are losing. And we continue to lose more if we don't do something about it. And it's not easy to convince a person who leaves the country under such a distress to give back to that country that is doing nothing for them, that is actually taking away from them, because even people who are abroad doing other work, they pay back taxes, they pay back remittances, and those resources, they are misused. So when you see such a abuse going on, it's not easy to convince a person to bring more and invest in such a drain. It's like you are trying to pour more in an empty basket, in a basket with holes. So how do we mobilize the African skills, the African skills that are in diaspora, the so-called brain drain, to invest back home in terms of skills transfer and in other resources? I think it all goes back to creating that awareness of having should I call it African patriotism? You know, creating people's awareness about having pride as Africans. Can we be proud like Africans? Can we desire to develop Africa? How do we cultivate that? How do we cultivate that mentality back again into people who have hopelessly left the continent because they were frustrated? And like I earlier said, I think we need to make people aware that if people back home are not respected Africans, if we want to regain respect even where we are in diaspora, we need to build a dignified African back home. We need to develop our continent so that we have a global voice, so that we are not undermined as beggars, as the rest of the earth. But the challenge is mobilizing all that. If we mobilize the resources for development, we can equally mobilize for politics, and we can equally mobilize the skills for economic development and education and otherwise. So if anybody is listening to this and they can create impact where they are, like Milton is in education, we work with other non-profit organizations, we all access different people. So it's upon each of us to try to create that awareness wherever you are, mobilize people where you can and talk to people. But most importantly, Lynn, you mentioned a think tank, creating like one big united voice, using social media, using internet. If we can find a way of uniting our efforts, we can create a big impact, and we can even change the brain drain into a positive change, because most of these professionals, when they left Africa, actually they developed their skills even much better, and we can easily plant back that knowledge into developing Africa. So if we can mobilize, if we can mobilize the energy, we can do a lot back in the continent, or we can do a lot to develop Africans wherever they are, not only in the continent, but even in diaspora.
Absolutely. Miriam, Dr. Sarah, allow me end with you. Milton is stepping away. Now, Milton, conclusively, looking at our topic this today, Africa Liberation Week, the role of African diaspora, in your conclusive remarks.
Well, as I said, I'm very optimistic. I think we have a potential to inspire African youth, just as, you know, when Nkrumah, for example, let me use Nkrumah as an example. He came to the United States in 1935, I believe. He got his education, and he was inspired by Marcus Garvey's teachings. Of course, Garvey was no longer in the United States at that time. He went to the United Kingdom. He attended the Pan-African Congress of 1945, and the focus of that Congress was African liberation and independence. When he came back to Ghana, he was invited to be the Secretary General of the United Gold Coast Convention, which was an elitist party. They were not demanding independence now. They were just wanting the British to open the doors for the educated elite in Ghana, the doctors, the lawyers, the other professionals, to sort of enter those closed doors, you know? So Nkrumah said, no, this isn't the struggle I want to be a part of. He quit and he formed his own political party, Convention People's Party. And he started going to the grassroots, the youth, the workers at the grassroots, and that's how Ghana won its independence. He took that knowledge acquired from the diaspora, connected to the youth. We need to do the same. We need to bypass the current leadership, so-called leadership, that are holding back the youth. We have the digital space, let's use that. As I said, I'm getting ready to try it with young people in Uganda. Let's try to multiply that and see what we can do. Because at the end of the day, your youth are the ones that need to liberate themselves. We can guide them and inspire them. So I'm very happy to have participated in today's conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Milton. Dr. Sarah, we end with you. And it is said that the African diaspora can contribute to Africa's GDP and development through investment, remittances, and the transfer of skills and knowledge. But we know how that is going. We know how bad that has gone. So the question here is, where does the diaspora go from here?
Well, at the time of independence and the liberation we are discussing, Africa had three key challenges: poverty, ignorance, and disease. We still have the same challenges. After more than 60 years of independence. Yeah, so the Africans in diaspora who have had exposure on how modern countries operate, how modern governments should look like, the roles and duties of leaders, should share this knowledge, should share their experience, should share their skills using the digital means and physical means whenever they can visit back home, to make sure that they take away the mindset, the primitive mindset of people who still look at leaders as same gods, who take services as a favor from their leaders and not an entitlement, people who do not know their rights and the duties of the leaders so that they can hold them accountable. So we need to share this knowledge, experiences, but also skills in how best to develop and exploit the big potential of the African people. So I hope that we can have these interface exchanges, both using physical and digital means with the Africans in diaspora for the benefit of the ordinary people in the African continent.
Absolutely. Miriam, do you have a conclusive remark there?
Yeah, I want to add to what Sarah has said. The experiences we have lived, Lynn, here we see governments working for the people. If you don't serve what people voted you for, they vote you out the next day. And democracy works. So the more, I think if we can share that, like in Uganda, there is a lie that democracy, is a foreign concept which can't be implemented in Africa, ABCD, that they use to hoodwink and deceive the Africans. If we can teach people how to demand accountability for their resources, if we can teach people how to be respected as citizens, the government has a duty to serve the people, to respect them, and listen to them, not the other way around. It's not about the people serving the leaders like gods and chiefs and whatever, but it's the leaders serving the people. And if we cannot serve, if you can't serve, the people should have the power to vote you out and put up leaders they want. So I think we can skills transfer, we can transfer the experiences, we can transfer the skills, we can really do a lot, the physical energy, we have the resources, and we also have the space. For instance, today we have access to internet, which most people in the continent cannot afford. It's very cheap here. We can easily mobilize, and sometimes we even have the money. And we have friends, we have people we can talk to, and organizations we can talk to, who are friends of Africa and are interested in making an impact. So if we can mobilize all that, I'm sure we can make a big difference, and Africa can still be liberated. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Miriam. Thank you, Dr. Sarah. It was lovely. And Milton, for making time to join us this for yet another episode of the Uganda Diaspora Show here on Civic Space TV, because it is on all social media platforms. So check it out on YouTube, on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram. I think we're about to be on Snapchat and TikTok as well. So we are the revolutionaries here. We are the change makers that we want to see, and we start today. So I wish you the very best, and we'll catch you again next time.